I'm very excited about my topic for today. That is how women are using human rights as legal and political tools to demand change in childbirth. So this is kind of a case study or an example of how women within social movements are using human rights as tool to demand change in something that is close to their own hearts. Before I go into the case study, I give you a little bit of a background. So we know that human rights have been used to secure women's rights in access to contraception, voluntary sterilization, safe abortion, and reproductive health information. Human rights arguments have also been used to protect women from involuntary sterilization and care that they do not wish for. Childbirth has so far mainly been seen as a matter of access to healthcare and survival. But I think this is changing now, and this is what my presentation is about. I will skip these. Okay, so about, I would say, not very long ago, a few years ago, we saw the birth of a new social movement called Human Rights in Childbirth. It all started with mothers taking legal action. Maybe you have heard about the Ternovsky versus Hungary case from the European Court of Human Rights. The judgment was out in 2010, so only 4 years ago. So this case is about a mother. She's pregnant with her second child. Her name is Anna Ternovsky. And this mother, she's planning a home birth with the midwife. But during the pregnancy, she gets concerned for the safety of her midwife because the legal situation in Hungary is unclear whether it's lawful for health professionals to assist at home births. Many midwives have been harassed, imprisoned, things like that. So Anna Ternovsky, she finds a lawyer and she sits down with this lawyer and they discuss the options. What can they do to protect midwife? And the lawyer suggests that they can bring the case to the European Court of Human Rights and that they can argue that childbirth choices, such as where to give birth, how to give birth, and with whom to give birth, are private choices and therefore protected by the right to private life, Article 8 of the Covenant. So when you read the judgment, the court finds a violation of Article 8. And the court is reviewing some evidence, mainly from the Netherlands, about the safety of home birth, stating that home birth is as safe as hospital birth for low-risk mothers if they have access to a skilled assistant. That is very important. So therefore, the court says that yes, childbirth choices are a matter of human rights, and the state should not interfere there. The woman should have the right to decide where to give birth, how to give birth, and with whom to give birth. Now, there have been at least two other cases that are pending before the court, one against the Czech Republic and another one against Lithuania. In both countries, home birth midwives have been imprisoned. So inspired by this, by the court's judgment and the success of Anna Ternovsky, other activism has also taken place. In May 2012, there was a major conference in The Hague called Human Rights in Childbirth Conference. More than 300 lawyers, midwives, doctors, doulas, and mothers and fathers got together for 2 days to discuss the most pressing issues of human rights in childbirth. Later the same year, September 2012, there was a film called Freedom for Birth that featured Anna Ternovsky, also the famous obstetrician and midwife Agnes Gereb, who until a few weeks ago was in home arrest in Budapest, and featuring many childbirth experts, such as Aina May Gaskin, Michelle Oden, and others. This film had more than 1,000 screenings in 50 countries in 17 different languages. More than 100,000 people saw the film on one day. So we see that this issue is touching people's hearts and minds, and that many women are engaging and wanting to demand change. So you may be wondering that why are these women, these mothers, complaining here in Europe, in the US, in Australia, and other rich parts of the world, where we have such a highly developed maternity care system? Very few babies and mothers are dying, in contrast to the poorer southern countries. And that is very true. We do not lose a lot of lives, but we do lose mental health, marriages, self-esteem. Women ask, what about cultural safety? What about social safety and spiritual safety? Childbirth is not only about survival, although that is, of course, ultimately the most important thing. There are also growing concerns about iatrogenic morbidity, the interventions and medications commonly used in hospitals around the world in the highly developed maternity care system are not free of risks. So the questions that the human rights in childbirth movement is wanting to highlight, I have listed them here, and these are the questions that all birth systems need to face in one way or the other. So who decides how a baby is born? Who chooses where a birth takes place? Who bears the ultimate responsibility for a birth and its outcome? What are the legal rights of birthing women? What are the responsibilities of doctors, midwives, and other caregivers in childbirth? And last, what are the rights and interests of the unborn, and how are they best protected? It comes down to the question about whose body, whose baby. And here I'm citing Anne Oakley. In entering hospital to give birth, a woman becomes part of that great and growing debate about who is having a baby, the mother, the medical profession, the hospital, the family, or the state. So a birth can look like this, or it may look like this. Either way, a birth is something that the woman will carry the memory of with her for the rest of her life. So more and more women start to describe what they experienced during childbirth as assault, abuse, or even rape. Anthropologist Sheila Kitzinger, who has started the Birth Crisis Network in Britain, claims that women who are distressed after birth use the same language as survivors of rape. They speak of shame and disgust with themselves and their bodies, about guilt that they in some way are to blame for the violence they experienced. They too have flashbacks, nightmares, and panic attacks. What makes birth even more complicated is that when birth is experienced as institutional rape, the woman is supposed to thank the very same people who violated her. She is caught between horror and gratitude. And this is a global issue. There is new research indicating that abusive care is a major deterrent from skilled birth assistance in many poorer countries. I have empirical evidence of this from Malawi, a country that I visited as a researcher in September last year. So this example shows that birth as a human rights issue raises complicated questions about autonomy, integrity, dominance, power, as well as safe motherhood. So let's look at one concrete example. Episiotomy, that is the medical term. It is an intervention that is very commonly used in childbirth. In Finland, it's at the moment around 23%. In many countries, it's a lot higher. In other countries, it's a lot lower. Like in Sweden, I think it's around 6%. This intervention has been discredited by research as harmful and unnecessary. What makes it even more complicated, besides the fact that it has been discredited by research, is that it's usually carried out without informed consent on behalf of the woman having the intervention, because it's carried out at the very end of labor, end of pushing. There is usually no time for consent. Not only is it unnecessary to inflict intentional vaginal trauma, it is also harming a woman on many levels. Cutting the perineum means severing the sexual nerve system, which is a serious interruption of a woman's bodily and sexual integrity, and would deserve more attention from a human rights perspective than it's given at the moment. Especially considering that there is also new research showing a connection between trauma to the vagina and the female brain. Vaginal trauma is not just physical. A fully functioning pelvic nerve system is crucial for producing the dopamine, oxytocin, and other chemicals that raise levels of perception, confidence, and feistiness. Mutilating the vagina has personal and political consequences. And dopamine has, by the way, been called the ultimate feminist drug. So some of you may be wondering or asking yourselves that what about the fact that we also see increasing evidence of increasing maternal choice? More women are choosing to have elective C-sections, scheduled inductions, and to some extent home births. So isn't this evidence of increasing maternal choice? Yes, I think it is. But the limits on maternal autonomy are still huge. It seems as if freedom has been defined as interference. In most countries with a highly developed maternity care system, women can choose anything but not an undisturbed birth. So we see that more and more women, out of desperation and fear of the consequences of going into hospital to give birth and the fear of losing their self-determination, are taking quite desperate measures. And some women are choosing unassisted births at home with no medical assistant whatsoever. And this is taking place also in Finland and Sweden. So summing up, the activists in the growing human rights in childbirth movement use human rights as legal and political tools to take birth back. They want to own their own births, and they are prepared to carry the responsibility that comes with that. They demand women-centered care rather than practitioner-centered care. They demand to be respected as the decision makers concerning their bodies. They want to decide where to give birth, how to give birth, and with whom to give birth. But why is all of this interesting from an academic perspective, you might be asking yourselves? For me, this is interesting because human rights are given content and meaning not only by legislators and courts, that is from above, but also by actors within social movements, that is more from below, through making claims like the claims that I have just been describing for you. And that is part of human rights practice. This conference is also part of human rights practice. And I think we need to study human rights practice in order to understand human rights drivers of change. So the international movement for women's rights has challenged the very meaning of human rights, actually for a very long time, I would say. The actors within the women's movement have not always and readily accepted the dominant social definition of human rights. On the contrary, they have always called for redefinition and pushed for new rights. And this is still happening. Human rights is an alive law that is evolving and developing all the time. And this case study that I have demonstrated for you here today, it shows how the meaning of human rights is constructed from the bottom up. So while the average woman wants to give birth in a hospital and is satisfied with the biopolitical regulatory framework under which childbearing women and their caregivers operate in Europe today, the human rights in childbirth movement highlights that a minority of women and some midwives demand a system that gives freedom to choose birth outside a medical institution. Thereby, the movement challenges legal, social, cultural, and medical norms in its campaigns for increased self-determination and autonomy for childbearing women. And it is proposing the right to privacy as the new norm based on the Ternovsky versus Hungary judgment from the European Court of Human Rights. Thank you very much for listening.